Доброго дня, шановні.
Good afternoon, dear friends, dear colleagues. As you probably know, per the request of the Ukrainian Institute of the Future, Prigozhin carried out his quasi-coup d'etat. It was all dedicated to today's lecture. Actually, we know what's going to happen in the future because we are the Institute of the Future. And so, if you're interested in what's going to happen next, we are ready to answer your questions for a very small sum. Second of all, I would like to take this opportunity to insert a little ad break. Um, I'm going to plug the book of Vadim Denisenko, which is Me, How to Destroy the Russian World. Everyone who wants to get that book can get that book for a very small sum of money. All of that money will be later donated to the armed forces of Ukraine. But coming back to the main topic, we have been preparing for this brief for quite a while. We have called this brief the short course on the Russian private military companies, the history, the influence, the logic of development. This is yet another course that is presented to you by the Ukrainian Institute of for the Future on what is happening in Russian Federation right now. And so before IHAR TYSHKEVICH, right here, is the author of this brief, prior to IHAR starting to talk about the brief itself, I would like to also say that I want to share the vision of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future of what has happened in the last week, during the last weekend, and we just want to share our hypothesis, the hypothesis of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. First and foremost, we believe that this was something that was planned. It was not spontaneous in nature. Second of all, the goal behind this quasi-coup was not overthrowing the Russian government as such, or overthrowing Putin and replacing him with Prigozhin or someone else, whoever that may be. In reality, the goal as we see it was to arrest or detain Shoigu in Rostov-on-Don, to force Shoigu to speak in front of the camera and mention some of the things that he has done or had not done in Syria, or what Prigozhin claims he has done, which will delegitimize Shoigu completely, and if needed, to launch a march towards Moscow. Since they were unable to detain Shoigu in Rostov, they decided to continue to move forward, but the idea was to delegitimize Shoigu and the higher military leadership of the Russian Federation. There are two main issues that arise here: whether has anyone assisted Prigozhin, why did he stop? To answer the first question, we think that he did receive some assistance externally. We can only express our hypothesis, and our hypothesis lies in the fact that, on one hand, that was someone from the Russian military intelligence department, from the general staff, and possibly there was some external factor, not Lukashenko at all, because Lukashenko could have played the role of the guarantor for Prigozhin, for anything. Why did he stop? Well, it is obvious there was some very simple reason for that. Besides all else, he got scared. He was scared of a couple of things. First of all, nobody joined him in this march. He was a person who worked quite closely with a couple of teams, with a Kovalchuk and Sechin team, and they were completely silent. There were no signals that they supported Prigozhin, so he felt no support. And being not a very dumb person, he understood that it could be possible to take the power. He could approach Moscow, he could enter Kremlin, but it would be so much more difficult to hold that power. It probably would not have been realistic, and that is why he made this very difficult and maybe deadly decision to turn around. But now we have this new page in this book where something will change in the history of private military companies in Russian Federation, and we think that Prigozhin will attempt to stay in Africa and to preserve his monopoly, or at least his military presence there. Whether he will succeed or not, we'll have to see, but I would like to give the floor to Igor for him to be able to share with you the logic behind the establishment of private military companies, how they function in Russian Federation, and everything else He can tell you about the private military companies. His speech will take up to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Very much flowing Q&A session. Good afternoon. So, briefly about my report. The idea for this report was very simple. There are many reports that just list private military companies, which is quite easy to do. If you track the information through different Telegram channels, different groups, that's not a problem. It's also not very difficult to understand where these private military companies are deployed, but if you look at the timeline, it turns out that there are certain patterns for the development of the private military companies, their influence and the decision-making within the Russian Federation, as well as the use of private military companies as a resource. And also, there is also the way they influence policy or policies. And so this report is on one hand based on the timeline of the establishment of different PMCs, but it's focused not on the personalities primarily, much rather it is instead focused on the logic behind these events and what can we expect from the future. Because yeah, for sure, when I was writing the small report on the Wagner PMC, it was the beginning of 2023, and the report was named How Long Will Prigozhin Last? And I believe that he would last for 6 months before his confrontations with the military leadership escalate. So I was only mistaken by a couple of months. It was not because I guessed or because I'm a psychic, but because there was a certain logic behind their development, and there was also the logic behind trying to dismantle the influence of a single PMC by developing many others. What is a PMC? There are a couple of definitions. There are international definitions, but within the Russian Federation as such, a PMC does not exist as a legal entity. It's not a thing. It is not defined by the laws. There is no legislation in place to define it. But how do we differentiate what can be called a PMC from volunteer fighters, mercenaries, etc.? And based on international definitions, based on the specificity of their activities, I suggest 4 main characteristics of a PMC. First of all, it is a non-state actor. It's important to have the structure exist legally separately from the state. So there's a separate decision-making center within this PMC. Second, it provides security services. There's a very important difference from regular security companies, because there is a company that provides security services, but also defense services. And when we talk about defense services, it requires different forces, different assets, different decision-making processes, different mechanisms. And unlike real security companies, PMC utilizes military resource rather than police or law enforcement resource. Third, they have more than one client. It is very important, because it's very easy to create a separate legal entity, to sign a contract with that legal entity to carry out a single mission. But if you have one client, if you have one customer, and if this customer commands you, that's just an interesting use of budget resources, and then this entity is not a PMC, and they cannot offer their services to different external clients. Because if we're talking about PMCs instead of mercenaries, they require a certain sense of independence, or at least limited liberty when it comes to choosing clients, which is why this is a very interesting topic. For sure, for a PMC, main customer might be the main intelligence directorate of Russian General Staff or certain corporations. But the main question here is whether they do these odd jobs from other clients. And that's what defines whether these companies can have the future. And also they have their own recruiting system and training system. This is also a yet important indicator, an important characteristic of the capability or longevity and capacity of this PMC. Because if you are recruiting individuals for a certain mission from different places without having your own system of training, support, this structure cannot exist for a long time. That's just a group of mercenaries recruited for a certain mission. Now, talking about private military companies and the non-state law enforcement agencies, Russian Federation and the Soviet Union quite often utilized entities that are not legal necessarily. They cannot, they're not necessarily private military companies, but they're not legal entities either. There's the so-called volunteer fighters. Those are either people who are in reserve or retired, or covert service members who were sent to certain conflict areas to carry out missions. They're not necessarily a private military company in a sense, but they exist, and there are quite many of them. This quasi-hybrid option existed in the combat military reserve of the country, right? This is a structure under the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, but in reality there are some sort of volunteers or like bars, right? Legally they use this structure, and then parts of the PMC as well as the regional formations. They're retired service members, former SOF service members. This group is much closer to PMCs, the retired group, but every security service, every law enforcement agency has this club of their retired service members that they can utilize for specific missions, especially in Russian Federation. There usually is the largest pool for recruiting for the PMCs. They exist. And these groups can eventually become real PMCs. Towards the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, there were certain law enforcement structures without any leadership. This is all in history. They did not appear today or yesterday, but there are certain examples that survived until 2023. But let's go back. The collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a decrease in the numbers of armies and armed forces in all countries, and so many units became dismantled. And so somewhere around 92 to 95, the industry of PMC did not really exist in our region. However, these dismantled units tried to find missions, tried to find jobs, and then intelligence. These are the groups, the sabotage and reconnaissance groups that are trying to pretend to be civilian to carry out certain missions. Once again, these are not the private military companies. And so let's go back to 1990, 1992. That's when the foundation for the establishment of Russian private military companies were first established, because Russian private military companies did not appear in 2013, 2014, or 2010, no. But so in 1990s, there was a large number of retired service members without any prospects for employment. Second thing, and that's actually very interesting, because in the United States of America, there were private military companies which recruited Russian retired service members, and so a lot of them migrated to the West to exchange information, and also there was an overall ideological crisis in the former Soviet Union states. Now let's go briefly through the timeline. All of these groups, they fought in almost all ethnic conflicts on the former Soviet Union territory, in Serbia, and were deployed in Asia. But I believe if we look at these four characteristics that I mentioned of a PMC, I believe that the starting point for the establishment of a real private military company was 1993. The end of 1992, the beginning of 1993, when in Bosnia, Soviet officers there were Strelkov, Girkin, and Rogozin amongst them. These Soviet officers were recruited into the first PMC that was called Slavic Wolves. And currently it's been restored under the leadership of Rogozin. Why was that a private military company? Well, first and foremost, they had a contract to defend this city. They had a parallel contract to loot valuables. They had yet a parallel contract to convoy, to escort convoys and to escort individuals evacuating. So they had a few customers. They have a few simultaneous contracts. They were renewed for years and years. So they were not just mercenaries. There was a system for decision making in place. There was a structure that existed. 1998. A second very interesting point in time. PMC anti-terror or anti-terror Orel was established thanks to Vnukova Airlines and the LDPR party. There was war in Yugoslavia, and it was important to ensure safe visits of certain Russian politicians to Yugoslavia and also to protect Russian assets in Yugoslavia and Russian businesses. So they start the first recruiting campaign, and they create this PMC that existed for quite a while. Next point in time. Yet another very interesting aspect is that from 1992 until 2005, because in 2005 they become completely formalized, there were this Cossack entities, Cossack establishment. Before 2005, it was very difficult to consider them PMCs, but in 2005 they adopt a law where on one hand this Cossack movement becomes subordinated to Putin through a specific council being established, and then on the other hand this law grants these NGOs the right to sign contracts to protect and defend certain facilities and also to ensure law and order. And so these activities are the source of funding for the Donsky group of Cossacks. And it is a significant source of funding, and so we can say that there's a separate type of PMC, the Cossack entities, Cossack PMCs. They can be established ad hoc, but the decision-making process is there, based on this Cossack districts. Next point in time, 1999. It's very interesting because this is yet another element, yet another stage of the establishment of these very first corporate PMCs. Because every transnational company, every large Russian company, they have their own security service. It was called the business security in the Soviet times. They have one customer. The first such customer was Lukoil. They turned their own security agency into a separate entity, Lukom-A. When this Lukom-A was established, they primarily recruited the retired service members from the Soviet internal service, Wimpel. They have official agreements with Wimpel veterans. Why is this a very interesting PMC? They are considered the second KGB because they specialized on technical means of information protection, on espionage, on industrial espionage, and on information search. And since they had this protection and mentorship from different security services, national security services, it allowed these people to visit not only the former Soviet states. I would like to remind you that we have this network of Lukoil gas stations, and so did Belarus, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. They also went. They had their assets in Libya and France, and that's where this PMC Lukom-A carried out their missions to protect these assets. Next point in time, 2004. The scheme was the very same, but this is a PMC that has not entered into force yet. If we look at this frozen assets, if we look at these pre-PMCs, Nornickel turned their security company into a separate entity. It was called the Department for the Protection of the Facilities of Precious Metals. But in 2005, the decision was made that the missions that Nornikal as a company, the geological missions that were carried out abroad, they would outsource security services for these missions. And so despite this company having their own security agency, having their own training system, their own tracking and surveillance systems, they can provide AP protection. They have not yet crossed the threshold where they can state, hey, we are an international PMC and we carry out all of these missions. Yet, at the same time, despite having faced this crisis, the company has not been dismantled yet. It still exists and they continue training and recruitment. 1999, 2003, and later. That's where Russians realized that PMC can be a tool to protect their own assets and businesses. War in Iraq. We know how actively PMCs were utilized in that war, but we don't know much. That there was this PMC called Armor Group. They were registered in Virginia. The owner was a citizen of the United States, a veteran from the Soviet Union. And so this PMC primarily consisted of retired Russians and Soviet service members in general. So those were Ukrainians, Russian, Kazakhs. From 2002 until 2022, there was also an international PMC that was sort of respected, that was Ruscorp Group. It was not active every single year, but they had their own offices in the United States of America, in Russia, in Syria, in Lebanon, in France, if I'm not mistaken, and also in 4 or 5 other countries. So just like many other PMCs, they had a couple of regional offices. They mostly dealt with physical protection of certain individuals and protection of assets of certain companies. But in 2022, last registered office was closed. Their activities ended in 2019, or at least the mentions about their activities ended in 2019. Because, of course, they might still be carrying out covert activities, which we may not be aware of. And so, the war in Iraq. That's where Russian private military companies were deployed. To the Iranian Kurdistan, to the border, Iraqi-Iranian border, Syrian border. There were a couple of private military companies that one of them was called the Tiger Top Run Security. Some of the analysts say that it's the same thing as Antiterror Orel. They just adopted a different name for this period of time. But if we look at the type of their activities, we know that Antiterror Orel was also deployed there. And so if we look at the type of the activities carried out by their chain of command, I think that those were just 2 different PMCs that closely cooperated, but they were different entities. And after the Tiger Top Run Security was dismantled, some of the mercenaries, some of their staff, moved on to, or established a couple PMCs, the Moran Security Group, Ferex, RSB Group, etc. And the most interesting one for us is the Moran Security Group, because Ferex and RSB Group were working on and off, protecting business interests, but Moran Security Group relied on ideology, because they were the ones who established a so-called Slavic Corps that was deployed in Syria. Mentions of this PMC first appeared in 2012, but the first units that were deployed, they were most likely deployed earlier. They were also in Sri Lanka, they were deployed in India and Myanmar, and where else, I can't really remember, but it doesn't really matter. But why is it important to keep the Moran Security Group in mind? Because the so-called Slavic Corps that was actively deployed in Syria closer to 2014, it was problematic. And I think that Slavic Corps is related to the last name that's very familiar to Ukrainian of Mr. Utkin And so they're facing this crisis as a Slavic core, and then this next stage, where the Slavic core plus Prigozhin equals PMC Wagner group. And so Prigozhin starts to mentor most of these mercenaries. But as a businessman, he understands that this is a gold mine. And from this smaller PMC, he starts to build an entire empire, where there's no longer any ideological background, but instead their capabilities to be deployed abroad, from small task forces and participation in political campaigns, all the way to frontline units. But that will happen a little later. Why were they successful? Well, a new private military company in stable environments might not be very successful when it comes to the number of customers, but Russia back then needed oil and gas sources outside of Russia. They needed geological reconnaissance and also sourcing of raw materials. So Prigozhin's scheme is very simple. They enter a country, they guarantee security at a certain location, and then by creating a joint venture with the local entities, they start the geological reconnaissance, but was probably paid for by Russian budget, by Russian funding. And they start to test the extraction of raw materials. Of course, the payment comes from outside, but everything you produce belongs to you, and so you get additional funds to fund your PMC. After that, the joint ventures went bankrupt, allegedly, and instead of Concord offices, there entered people connected to either Sechin from Rosneft or with Kovalchuk from the Russian bank. So they entered to replace Prigozhin's companies. So they had these two contracts in place. And that's how they received a guaranteed income from different countries, which allowed them to carry out active recruiting, which in turn allowed them to sift through a very large number of individuals and to create this core group that would be capable enough to be deployed at the most profitable areas. 2014-2015, they needed these PMCs in Ukraine, and they established a range of different PMCs that carried out different roles. Some of them fought at the front lines, from small task forces all the way to large formations. Some of the ones who were more experienced were used as instructors. For example, the RSB group, they would come as instructors. And yet another part dealt with the protection of individuals or evacuation. There was yet another very interesting line of effort. We have spoken a lot about theft of Ukrainian industrial property. And these convoys were protected not by the Russian army. So imagine, engineers are deployed, protected by these PMCs, created specifically for this purpose, and they loot Ukrainian industrial property. 2015, Syria, and that's where Shoigu had his PMC Patriot, and that's where the first virtual PMCs first arrived. So that's an instance where these PMCs are mentioned, but they don't really exist, like the Islamic Battalion, etc. This is an attempt to create the smoke screen, to deceive everyone. Since Syrian campaign was funded from the Russian budget, because it's one thing when you fund one company, but then there's a whole different situation when you say, hey, we have this 100 fighters, they're Muslims, they don't speak Russian, let's fund them as well. So it might have been a way to launder money, but this was the first virtual PMC, and so this was the first time when the so-called Ukrainian PMC was mentioned that allegedly was deployed in Syria. And of course there were a couple of Ukrainians amongst the founders of this PMC, but it's very difficult to call this PMC Ukrainian because in 2012 the primary founder of this PMC immigrated to Russia, and the second founder that was there at the beginning but then he left later, He has founded his own security company that exists right now in Ukraine, and so the Ukrainian part of that PMC remained decent. 2018, I did not mention it here, but that was a crisis of the genre. The frontline froze, and what did they have to do with this large number of PMCs? And that's why many of the PMCs ceased their activities, or they started to take orders from foreign consumers. The exception was the RSB group. They would escort the ship convoys in the pirate danger zones because they had both Western and Eastern customers. Prigozhin was an exception because at that point in time he entered Africa and he gained the monopoly there because more than 80% of the Russian PMC presence in Africa is from Prigozhin's PMC. And so these maps where Russians are protecting, where Russians are providing their presence in Africa, and the map of deployment of PMC Wagner, these maps match up. 2022-2023 is a point in time when PMCs were needed at the front line as assault units. Why was that? Well, let's look at the logic here. Why they needed these frontline units and why they needed the PMCs to do it. First and foremost, they had this issue of they're not there, of pretending that this is not the real Russian army present. Because when Putin stated that in 2014 that there were no official Russian military units there, and they weren't really there before Ilovaisk, before Russian task forces were there, because if someone was taken prisoner of war, those were Kazakhs or retirees or whoever, they needed a reason to pretend like the regular Russian units were not there, which made it very difficult for the Ukrainian side to prove their relations with the official Russian military, and also this unofficial hiring process of the employees, beside Kazaki. Those were the retirees as well, and those were the types of personnel that Russia has been actively using since 1990s. Some of them are actually active duty officers, and some of them are just drafted ad hoc to carry out certain missions. The establishment of the so-called volunteer formations. Of course, they have this right-wing volunteers, they have the fascists that want to go fighting. And then in 2014, when they needed to saturate the front line with the irregular armed formations, that's when they addressed the private military companies that at that point in time were either already established or were being established. Why? Why they resort to using PMCs? The political risks are much lower. Because if there is this body of a Russian soldier with his military ID, it is a body of a Russian soldier. It is, if they have a body of a Russian mercenary, that's a mercenary. That's very different. They're also very cheap. Why is it cheaper to recruit PMCs? Well, they ask for more money, do they not? Well, we do not look at the issue of the social guarantees for the families. If a service member of the Russian armed forces dies on the front line, for example, a soft service member, they have to pay welfare payments and compensations to their families. But if a mercenary from a PMC dies on the front line, there might be some small compensation from the PMC itself, and that's it. And that's the best case scenario. And it is not. This money does not come from the state budget. And so, on the short-term perspective, it might seem like PMCs are more expensive, but if we look over a mid-term perspective at least, it's much cheaper. Second, the decreased threat from the dangerous citizens. Of course, there are people who have served in the military, who have combat experience. There are people who think that war is their entire life, and so they're adrenaline dependent. And when these people live in a peaceful society amongst other people, it might increase the rate of criminality in the country. But if these individuals are physically outside of the country's borders, carrying out certain missions, some of them die, and some of them are physically outside of the country. They cannot commit crimes. And the last one, the possibility of the government entering the area when it's safe. So the most typical example is Africa, when, for example, PMCs stabilize the situation first, like in Madagascar. The PMC stabilizes the situation and then leaves, and after that, either regular armed forces or the state, any state entities enter. Even though local elites understand that the foundation for this force projection has been carried out by PMCs. Libya is the most active example of where the strategy failed because Russian PMCs are protecting Russian assets, but it is very difficult to reach an agreement between the two governments. There's also Mali, because Wagner Group has agreements with certain field commanders, but it is not clear who's gonna win. Situations where this strategy will probably succeed is a Central African Republic, where it is already happening, but on the level that PMC instructors are still staying there in Angola, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar. So it is a possibility to lower the risk for the government when they are first projecting their initial interests onto a foreign country. This presentation does not have it, but the report itself contains more missions or more lines of effort for the PMCs. I have identified 15 lines of effort that Russian PMCs can have. I'm going to take off my glasses and read those to you. So, the protection of industrial facilities, the protection of offices and residential areas, personal protection, protection of valuables, convoy and escort, protection, sea escort, training, police missions, military missions, sniping, combat divers, anti-terror operations, thanks to the British contract to demine certain areas. They were able to train deminers. Propaganda, espionage, Locom A, industrial espionage, Locom A, and PMC Охорона, that was established recently by Rosneft. And so the report actually contains these lines of effort for different PMCs. And how did I look at their activities today? Well, I monitored mentions in the local media if these missions are abroad, as well as different channels from different social media in Russia. And every PMC in my report has their specialization in this table. I would like for you all to understand that not all PMCs are deployed in Ukraine. Definitely not all Russian PMCs. And at the beginning of 2022, Russia only had 15 active PMCs. Now, as of May 5th this year, when I finished this report, they had 28 active PMCs. This means that they had this growth that happened over the course of the last 7 to 8 months. Why did that happen? Well, the efficiency of PMC as a replacement for regular forces and irregular forces and the replacement of the Russian military. Thanks to bots and the PMCs, Russia was able to postpone mobilization from the summer of 2022 to the late fall. This allowed them to decrease these social tensions, to postpone these social tensions. Also, it's cheaper in long-term perspective, and they didn't have to save human resources, especially if we're talking about prisoners recruited to these PMCs. However, there's also this very interesting situation that happened with Prigozhin himself, because if there is this industry that is not regulated, not legalized in any way, there's an issue that arises. What is going to happen to it? Not with a single PMC, but with all of them, with an industry in its own right. Who is going to govern this area? this industry. And so the crisis between Prigozhin and Shoigu, even though it has been happening for a couple of years and it started way before 2022, it reached its pinnacle in 2022 because Prigozhin saw a chance. If PMCs can turn into a separate industry, a separate area within the law enforcement system, they need a mentor. And the mentor who will govern this area of law enforcement, they could be compared to the head of the FSB, for example. And I'm going to reference my older report. And if before Prigozhin had this role of odd jobs, doing odd jobs, if he were to become this mentor for all of the PMCs, he would be a different person. He would be existing on a very different playing field. And that was the reason for this crisis. The person doing odd jobs wanted to become one and equal with the leaders. And so, of course, either he reaches this higher level and he limits the influence of Shoigu, or his structure is destroyed. The logic behind the establishment of new PMCs, quite often they copied the structure of Wagner PMC. There was this attempt to create PMCs using the money from the state corporations, as was the case with Gazprom, for example. But for now, Gazprom's security service has not turned into a separate PMC because it's cheaper for them to use the state budget rather than to use their own money for those services. It's also a very interesting topic with Rostech and Roscosmos because their security service have not yet turned into separate PMCs yet. They just sponsor other PMCs. And also an attempt to create new PMCs, right? And it's very important because since the phrase PMC became popular, not all the things in Russia that are called PMCs are PMCs in essence, because there's this security agency, PMC Garant. They have 40 people that protect Kaliningrad port. What kind of PMC is that? But it is called a PMC, and they have approximately 18 of these fake PMCs. They're virtual, they're not even real, come on. Because if we look at the real PMCs, they're not called PMCs, right? They can be, for example, a legalized task force from BARS 13, for example, right? They have separate structures, they have separate training facilities, they have their own commands, they have additional contracts, but they're BARS, right? That's what they're called. And so these formats exist, and what I outlined here, look, all of the PMCs are included in this table, and there are two levels based on whether they have an ideological background, whether they are advocating for the greater Russia, the Russian world, the unicorns, whatever. And then based on who is the primary customer. So if we look at the ideological background and in the primary customers, we have the PMCs that are working with different types of customers. For example, the more security groups are based on Slavic wolves, so they had this ideological background, but currently they're dealing with a very interesting topic. For example, oil exports. Russia has purchased a large number of oil tankers, and some of them have armed security. That's not on the front lines, right? And so armed security, armed convoy of these tankers, armed protection of these oil tankers, with all due respect to our American and Western partners, no one will attack these tankers without official declaration of war. So it's either more security group or RSB groups that monopolize the armed security of oil tankers. And so to say that This company has any ideological background left now? Well, the key leaders, they have partially joined Wagner Group or some others, but the ones who remained under the name Modern Security Group, they escort ships. They're fine. And then if we're talking about just business, yeah, of course, they work for the Russian state, but they are earning money. They are earning money through war. There's also this very interesting tendency. Despite the conflict of Prigozhin and Shoigu, despite all of these things, the decrease in the number of PMCs is unlikely to happen because there is this wave of statements that PMCs have to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. But look at it. There are contracts of separate mercenaries from the different PMCs, where they're added into different units. And then if a PMC is respectful of the rules of the Ministry of Defense, they are allowed to maintain their own structure, their own command, but they're now subordinated to the Ministry of Defense, and they receive money from the Ministry of Defense, and the number of a military unit assigned to them. And so these are the two new models of introduction of PMCs into the Ministry of Defense. However, when the Ukrainian UAVs flew over the territory of Russia, there was this very interesting couple of statements from the leaders of the Duma committees that Russian corporations could have dealt with air defense on their own. And so that was an invitation to create PMCs. Because once again, the main difference between security agencies and PMCs are whether it is security or defense, because a security agency cannot be equipped with stingers or any other air defense means. And so there is this impetus to have the state security agencies. There's this demand for the state security agencies to create their own private military companies, or at least their own militarized units. And so, having considered this, can someone help me fix the slides, please? The equipment is probably tired. I'll go off by memory. There are a couple of processes that are happening simultaneously right now. The first, I have described it already too. This is segmentation, the fragmentation. It has started when it comes to the area of activities. This fragmentation has happened and it will continue to happen, which means that we'll have a couple of clusters of private military companies. The first is the frontline, right? Frontline private military companies. The second cluster would be the ones that deal primarily with the protection of business interests, and the third would be the representation of Russian interests abroad, the force projection. That's what Wagner used to do. And this segmentation, this fragmentation based on their primary activities will continue. And since there's this process of establishment of PMCs by large corporations, we are entering the format of private armies or corporate armies. At the current stage, most likely most of them will be formally subordinated to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. However, if, for example, Gazprom funds 3 battalions, which they are larger than battalions right now, even despite having the formal subordination to the Ministry of Defense, will Gazprom lose the control over these private military companies? If Roscosmos, for example, states that they will establish their 2 task forces of BARS and Roscosmos will be paying their salaries, will they ever lose control over these private armies, even if they're subordinated to the Ministry of Defense? And this is basically a guarantee that most of these industries are getting for the potential destabilization in the country. This process has started in 2022, quite recently, but it has started. And despite the crisis of relationships between Shoigu and Prigozhin, this process did not stop. Maybe it will become less public, but this process will continue to happen. And so the rise of corporate armies is the near future, 12, 18 months. It's hard to say whether they will be separate units, and there's this issue of legitimization and legalization. Legitimization has already happened. Let's go back to the moment when Putin thanked the Wagner fighters for seizing Bakhmut. This was the first stage of legitimization. Currently, maybe this process will come to a halt because PMCs are now a dangerous topic to discuss in Russia, but the process will continue to happen quite slowly. And then legalization, because out of all of these formations, only Kazakhs have the law backing up their activities. When it comes to the law on PMCs, many different speakers from the State Duma and the Federation Councils mentioned these laws in Saturday, and then on Monday, a lot of people started sharing backlash. There's not a good time to adopt this law, but the country has 28 PMCs. They will have to come back to the idea of adopting a law. And so, despite this crisis with the Wagner group, the issue of legalizing and the issue of having an established format for the future activities of Russian PMCs, this question is still open for debate because there are a couple of options. The first one is the complete subordination of all frontline PMCs to the Ministry of Defense, but then why do they need a separate recruitment system? And then how how are they to be sustained between the wartime and peacetime? The second option is the corporate option, to make sure that the state corporations fund these PMCs. And that might be beneficial to the state corporations in their own right if the operation of PMC Wagner will be limited by Africa, African continent, or like separate countries, because it would mean that when industries enter countries, they would enter with their own PMC, and then there's an issue of recruitment here, right? Because it's one thing when you have a well-trained unit who is prepared to operate in a certain area, and then the other completely different scenario is when you recruit people anew. And the third option, and I'm leaning towards that one, it might happen sooner or later. I think later, closer to 12 months, they will come back to discussing the adoption of a law on the private military companies, and they will attempt to create a separate legal area for PMCs. The mentor for all PMCs, they will have to come from within the system. So the mentorship over these PMCs it will be coveted. And FSB, main intelligence directorate, and others will fight for this mentorship right. It will be an attempt to actually identify these mentors from inside the system. That's it. Thank you. It's very simple. We invite the audience to ask questions. Thank you so much for a very comprehensive brief. I wrote down a range of questions, but let me start with the most interesting ones. First of all, where you mentioned the main characteristics of the PMC, should there be a system of relationships with a state in place? Why didn't you mention it? A system of relationships with a state is a non-state registration status, right? That's what I mentioned. Because it could be different. For example, if we talk with RSB Group, it is registered outside of the Russian Federation. However, they are taking orders from Russian companies to protect oil tankers from pirates, right? And so separate specialists of this PMC are citizens of Russian Federation. That's one system, one type of relationships. If we're talking about Wagner Group, one thing are Wagner Group teams deployed in Ukraine, and then the other thing are the PMC Wagner teams deployed in Mali, they have different relationships with the governments. Of course, they do have some sort of relationship, and the state is one of the customers for these PMCs. The question here is that the nature of these relationships is very different for each PMC, because if we're talking about a frontline PMC, the role of the government is to provide them with combat support and combat service support. But if we have a PMC that protects two political ideologists, like Prigozhin had in Madagascar, to ensure the proper results of the election, that's a whole different thing, because the government just asked to help with the propaganda, right? And it was stated that if you find a raw material source, half of that is yours. So, second question: is the increase of the number of PMCs a sign of Putin gathering more resources to counter potential coups? No, not really, because as of today, PMCs are an attempt to postpone the issue of mobilization and to hide the issue of significant casualties. Because I would like to bring you back to the law that alleviates the liability for individuals who signed contracts with the Russian government. So the people who were recruited from prison and who fight in this war, the criminal liability is later alleviated. And this also covers the individuals who are under pretrial investigation. And so it allows for the government to detain people and tell them, hey, you can sit here for 2 years with having this in your record, or you can go to war for 6 months and then we close the case. So as of today, PMCs are the demonstration that the resources of the Ministry of Defense cannot cover all of the needs, and without a large-scale mobilization, they have to patch up the front lines somehow. Yet another question. Yeah. Is it Can we consider the establishment of PMCs and the number of PMCs a way to canalize electoral resource of the Wagner party for the next election? Partially, but the issue is that the numbers of PMC fighters exceed any capabilities for canalizing these resources, and also there are people who have fought in Ukraine already, and so the issue of having a military party or like a veteran political party, they are a significant issue, and Prigozhin considered this as a reserve platform. Another thing is that elections into the Russian State Duma will happen in a year, and so the political party will be established later on. We had this piece of news today that the remnants of the Rodina party will try to come together. This is an attempt of a false start to actually show that they are occupying this place. Can I ask, is there any statistics, are there any data pertaining to how often do Ukrainians join these PMCs? No, I did not study that. I did not study these statistics pertaining to how many Ukrainians join these PMCs, because I try to analyze the logic in itself. It doesn't matter whether we're 100, 115 people who were born in Ukraine and joined PMCs. It does not matter to me. I don't really care. Once again, I don't care. It doesn't matter. I was interested in how much will these PMCs influence processes in Ukraine, Ukrainian politics, and how much will these PMCs influence Russian politics and situations in Russia. I'm just going to give you a very simple example. I told you that there was this example of a so-called Ukrainian PMCs. No, an individual is officially Ukrainian citizen, but they have been living in Moscow since 2012. If you're talking about numbers, think about the passportization. From 2018 until today, 1 million people have received Russian passports through forced passportization. Could they be recruited into Russian PMCs? Could some of them be forcefully detained and then recruited? Sure. Passportization this year has been extremely significant. Do we consider them Ukrainian citizens or Russian citizens? Because they have two passports now. So I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me. I have a question. In some of the circles, there's this very popular opinion that the conflict of Prigozhin and Shoigu started long before this because of the conflict in the Central African Republic during the raw diamond extraction. If you have heard about this theory, I'm just going to give you a couple of very simple facts. Prigozhin structures are contractors for food provision within their armed forces Russian Federation. Prigozhin also has contractors that are building a couple of Russian military bases. And there's also the issue of Syria. There's also this personal relationships between two men who, on personal level, hate each other, just personally. That's it. Thank you. I joined you a little later, so if my question has been answered already, I'm sorry, but I'm really concerned about it. You have mentioned that Russian private military companies are following the traditions of American private. No, I did not say that. Yes, that's why my question, maybe I'm wrong, but do correct me if I'm wrong. American process of establishing private military companies is a part of the corporatization process within the state, whereas the state is outsourcing prisons and some other functions. For Russia, this is much rather a display of hybridization of the political process, whereas the state is attempting to act through proxies without displaying the government state presence. So my first question is whether these PMCs in the US and Russia, whether it's the same thing, whether it's a manifestation of the same process, or whether these are completely different notions, and also are we dealing with the transformation or rebirth of the state that we're all used to, whether the state is rebirthing into something else? Okay, I'm going to start with the second question. If we're talking about the political processes, we see this wreck in the traditional understanding of the state. There's a crisis of democracy, there's these systematic outsiders, so you have this classical state crisis in place. When it comes to the American or non-American PMCs, I'm sorry, but the dozen of the most effective PMCs are: one of them is from Australia, one of them is from New Zealand, two from Great Britain, one from South African Republic, and one more, if I'm not mistaken, from South America, I think Brazil or something. But it doesn't matter. The question here is the processes are similar, right? Because both for the United States of America and for the Russian Federation, the ability to shift some of the risks onto proxy forces is very beneficial. Saying that some of them are moral, some of them are immoral, it's not a thing. Because some of the British PMCs do not participate in frontline operations by principle, but they are very professional when it comes to protecting convoys in conflict zones. Some of the American PMCs specialized in frontline operations, some of them specialized in police operations, and so to compare them that they're all the same and they all follow the same patterns, no, I provided to you 15 lines of effort for different PMCs, except for espionage. Many of these lines of effort are common for the different PMCs. And so we can say that PMCs from within one line of effort in one country are similar to PMCs from the same line of effort from another country. As far as I understand, your opinion is that the process of PMC establishment in Russia will continue because it corresponds to the contemporary requirements, to the contemporary state of affairs in Russia, but from the viewpoint of the interest of separate Kremlin towers and separate law enforcement agencies, let's say FSB, for example, or the current military leadership, if Shoigu stays there, would it not be an issue for them, especially if there's this very negative precedent with the Wagner PMC? Why would they allow to have these additional challenges in place because their interest is monopolization. They want to monopolize the law enforcement powers and the defense powers. Look, they also might want to control the law enforcement functions. I'm going to give you another example. This is a very in-depth conflict between the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Cossack organizations. That conflict ended in 2005 because there was a law adopted on these Cossack organizations when these essentially PMCs were subordinated to the presidential administration. And that's when this conflict ended. They started to augment each other. As of today, if we are mentioning the interest of the main Department of Intelligence, the general staff, PMCs carry out their missions. If we're talking about the interest of the Ministry of Defense, in some areas, PMCs can augment the the active duty troops. In some areas, they might harm these efforts. If we're talking about FSB, Locom-A carries out espionage missions. They cooperate quite well. The issue is that as of today, there's not really a law in place that would normalize this type of activities, and once again, they do not have a mentor for all the PMCs. If there is this yet whole industry, right? Whole area. Before Prigozhin's march, if this sector, this industry was established, Prigozhin was considered for the mentor position. But now, for the next year or two, the system outsiders will not be considered for this mentor role. And of course, there will be competition between the FSB, between the external foreign intelligence, between the Ministry of Defense for this mentor role. But we should not forget that state enterprises might also play a role because they might also have their own players presented for that mentor role from Gazprom, from Rosneft. We should not forget about them as such. But the thing is that they will have to have a mentor that comes from within the system, from within Kremlin towers. That's what has changed. Considering the most recent events, at the example of Wagner and Prigozhin, we saw that if they will have more of these PMCs, it will be good for Ukraine, right? For Russia to have this uncontrollable PMCs because it will shake the foundations of the Russian state. And then in your presentation, you did not mention this so-called national armies because they're creating a lot of battalions from Tatarstan or Akhmat from Chechnya, right? And they have different characteristics. They are not based on ideology of large Russia, or they're not motivated by money. Is there a perspective that this national armies will become armies if the time comes? Okay, so first and foremost, in my report about Russian elites, I have mentioned why it is impossible for Russia to fall apart into separate national entities as of today, because from the viewpoint of economy, from the viewpoint of leadership, just 3 weeks ago, we wrote that the technocratic group controls 50 from the 89 subjects of the Federation. Currently, they control 52 subjects of the Federation. These are the people who control certain regions. When it comes to Akhmat, I mentioned Akhmat as an example in my report because one of the topics in the agreement of Kadyrov clan and Putin is that Chechnya will not have any Russian troops deployed there. And they did not have any Russian troops there until 2023, but they had separate special forces units within Rosguardia. And each of those units is named after Akhmat Haji Kadyrov, Akhmat Kadyrov, Akhmat Sever, and they call themselves Akhmat as such. So there is no such a thing as an Akhmat PMC. No, it's just a PSYOPs campaign to confuse the onlookers from other countries and to make them feel scared, or even to make Russians feel scared. Hey, Ahmad will come for you. Now, can you imagine that can be like a former um, road police officer from from a small village because they call themselves Ahmad as well sometimes, and so it plays for this larger image of these TikTok forces. There's no such thing as unified Ahmad. When it comes to the transformation to national armies, Chechnya is an exception because most of them are established as bars or established by one of the government corporations, one of the state corporations represented in that area. For example, Roscosmos deploys, recruits tank soldiers from Buryatia, but it does not mean they will have a separate Buryatia tank brigade that will try to stage a coup against Kremlin. No, because they're funded from the Roscosmos budget. Even if we look at also the so-called national battalions that were established in Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, they are very far from a unified national organization. They are not dominated by the national idea. And so, talking about this establishment of separate national armies, that's not really a thing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Igor, for a very comprehensive report. I have two questions. The first is, what are the recruitment sources for PMC Wagner? What is the ratio of retirees to prisoners? And the second question is, what do you think was the offer made to Mr. Prigozhin that forced him to stop this march of justice? Because as we know, the lost revolutions have usually very bloody retaliation. So, what do you think was the offer? Okay, let's go to the second thing, because that's what Vadim started with. I would like to highlight once again what I started my speech with. Prigozhin's march was not a revolution. It was a fight of a military leader against a political leader to become a political leader himself. Tsar was never in danger. It was not a revolution at all. It had no potential of a real coup. If we're talking about the recruiting system and the components of Prigozhin's PMC, that's also something that I mentioned because I mentioned a text on the website of a Ukrainian Institute for the Future, How Long Will Prigozhin Last, where I mentioned the possibility of escalation in 6 months. Wagner Regiment has a couple of mercenary teams. The first mercenary team consists of the people who started uh, working within the PMC abroad a while ago. They have more than 10 years of experience. There is a so-called core. That core is not deployed in Ukraine. It was and it remains in Africa. And these are the individuals that Prigozhin does not want to waste under no circumstances. The second segment, looking at Syrian campaigns and others, they can be called the so-called Wagner veterans. They're the people who participated in one or two missions, but for one reason or the other, they're not within the core group. They are used and have been used in Africa, and also they are on the command positions in Ukraine, and they're also used as instructors in Ukraine and other regions. And the third type are the mercenaries. Where do they recruit these individuals? The smallest number is a general recruitment from the recruitment centers in St. Petersburg, etc. But they're suffering a crisis of recruitment for more than 3 months because other PMCs started to advertise themselves. Hey, we are offering the same benefits, but we have much lower casualty rate. There's also the citizens from very underprivileged areas, and this is a very strong source of recruitment because, for example, when I studied the situation in Tuva, when it comes to the salary levels, they have the highest salaries in Russian Federation. But when it comes to unemployment, they also have the highest unemployment rate in Russian Federation. So either you're in the army, you're in the police force, or you're in the local administration. There's no other way to earn a living. And so when you're approached by a recruiter who offers you a contract, you sign that contract. And the third source of recruitment are the prisoners. Of course, they are suffering great casualties, but to say that they're running out of prisoners, that would be wrong. And so, if we're talking about Wagner Group, they are mainly sourcing their mercenaries from prisons and the underprivileged areas of Russian Federation. Thank you. When you mentioned Wagner in 2014-2015, you have briefly glossed over the issue that Wagner Group is the product of the main intelligence department of the general staff, and they found Prigozhin as this just rich individual, and that's why they were first deployed in Luhansk in 2015, because the main directorate of intelligence of Russian Federation was deployed in Luhansk at that point. And so this monster was their brainchild that they created. I think that happened in 2022, in the second half. This brainchild has grown to an extent where the main intelligence director of the Russian Federation was no longer under control, was no longer controlling most of these processes. No, I'm approaching my question. So, do you think they have raised this monster, right? Who was trying to overthrow the presidential government? Do you think that it will influence the process of establishment of other PMCs? Will the law enforcement agencies play a role in those processes to avoid raising this beast? Look, I'm going to mention this once again. I have already said it. Prigozhin's march was not threatening the president's role at all. Putin was under no threat. Of course, maybe some people thought it did, but once again, we may argue here, but fine, okay. People were under the impression that there was this coup, right? There were many coups in Russian history, and not all coups resulted in Tsar's death. When it comes to the establishment of these agencies, of course, Slavic Corps was created under the influence of the main intelligence directorate of the Russian Federation. Their deployment in Ukraine was also under the influence of the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff of Russian Federation. But to say that they're no longer under control, it has been 15 years since Wagner has been deployed in many other countries except for Syria. And for many years, this intelligence directorate is only one of the customers of Wagner Group, one of the many customers. And so what is the role of Prigozhin? He saw this resource of PMC and he realized how he could utilize this resource on a global scale. Of course, this is a delayed fuse mine. Sure. Because Prigozhin is not lying. This is yet another armed force is being established, partially within the country and partially outside of the country, under control of a single individual. Of course, it is a challenge for Russian elites, but this will not stop the process of establishment of new PMCs, and new PMCs will be established with the support of special services. That's nothing new. They will not try to invent a wheel. Good evening. Putin demonstrated the numbers of how much money they have spent on the PMCs. When we're talking today about the fact that Wagner Group just left to Belarus, does that mean that they will lose their contracts in Africa? Because it's one thing when they're backed by the state, and then it's second thing when they are now independent. Okay, my report mentions this. First and foremost, if we're talking about Wagner Group, maybe they will be separated into two large groups. This crisis influenced only a part of the Wagner PMCs that fought in Ukraine. That's it. So it's impossible to talk about PMC Wagner as a whole anymore. When it comes to supporting the business, of course, Prigozhin might approach this with the idea of splitting one structure into two smaller structures. Of course, frontline operations were funded from the Russian budget. What was the scheme of funding for African operations? I have mentioned here. there was a contract on one hand with the Russian government, on the second hand there was a contract with the local governments to ensure a security system, to provide geological reconnaissance. So when we're talking about the African continent, the role of the Wagner PMC will still remain very significant even without Russian government funding. There is a mission in Mali, which is funded through income from other countries, a mission in Madagascar with minimum expenditures. It provided funds for Mozambique and a couple of other countries. So if we're talking in general, the Wagner is very profitable in the African continent. Think about the extraction of oil and gas, right? They're dealing with it. Who's dealing with that? Rosneft, Lukoil, Novotek, and others, right? Their own security system is a luxury that only Lukoil could afford. But in Nigeria, Lukoil does not use their own security agencies. They employ Wagner Group. So as of today, the state corporations do not have the combat potential to replace Wagner. Even when it comes to the extraction of these basic raw materials in the short-term perspective. So for sure, for a long-term perspective, this is yet another impetus for them to scale up their own security services and create their own PMCs. But for the short-term perspective, it is impossible to do. And it would be impossible to kick out Prigozhin out of Africa completely, because in different countries, the nature of these agreements that they sign is very different. And quite often it is based on individual person-to-person contacts, peer-to-peer relations. You cannot send Lavrov to talk to a field commander in Mali, despite the fact that there is uranium and titan to be extracted there. You cannot send Lavrov there. And the same goes for a couple of other states. Are there any more questions? Let's do two more and that's it. First and foremost, thank you for your report, for your briefing. I have a very brief question. When we are talking about the PMCs that are actively participating in combat, what do we know about their structure? Do they follow the same structure as regular military units? Do they have their own structure? Do they work as task forces for specific missions? So I'm interested in the fact of whether Wagner itself, that is fighting here in Ukraine, whether they are following the same force composition at the level of platoons, battalions. Okay, look, it depends on the PMC. The answer is very simple. In 2014, 2015, Ukrainian volunteer battalions, did they all follow the formal structure of the armed forces of Ukraine? Or did they have their own structures? It's the same for the PMCs. They choose a structure that is most sustainable for their mechanisms, for their missions. The former Mari is a переговорщик. They're working on evacuating important persons for the Russian government since the very first day of combat in 2022. Why do they need a battalion company? No, they use a task force, small task force, 15 people max. They receive fire support from either PMCs deployed adjacently to them or regular Russian military, so they don't need any of that. They don't need fire support units. If we're talking about the training PMC, they don't need platoons or companies or battalions. There's no point. Thank you, Mr. Igor. Could you please tell us how interested are transnational companies in Wagner PMC as a tool, and how interested are intelligence services of other countries? And then my second question is, what was the role of Lukashenko, do you think, at least if we're talking about media? How significant was his role? Okay. First and foremost, from the viewpoint of PMC Wagner and transnational companies, PMC Wagner is not as interesting because there's a crisis associated with it. But on the other hand, if we're looking at RSB Group or other PMCs, Western transnational companies recruit them quite often. For example, there is a need to transfer a tanker through the Mediterranean Sea. It's cheap, it's professional, so they are quite often recruited when they're transnational companies, and when they're PMCs, there will be business deals in place. Talking about Lukashenko, well, first and foremost, there will be a limited number of Wagner PMC personnel deployed in Belarus. The PMC of Wagner has 25,000 service members. Only 7 participated in the march. Let's mention the commanders of these units. What do we know about General Mizintsev, the one who took Rostov? Before May of 2023, that was a deputy of the Russian Ministry of Defense on combat service support. We don't know nothing. So some of them will be integrated into other units, other structures, other bodies. So we're talking about Prigozhin himself and some of his top commanders who he wants to take out of Ukraine, to deploy them somewhere else. I don't know if Utkin was there, if Utkin was on that march. I don't know, cannot tell you. We'll see. Even if he will be there, what will it change? The thing here is that from the political viewpoint, there is this huge bonus that Lukashenko received. If we look at the fact of how Russia communicated with all the former Soviet states, they had this narrative that Moscow is feeding you. Russia build your industries. You owe Russia. Russian propaganda did not know what to do, so they started spinning this issue of the coup, of the alleged threat to the Russian Federation. And then there's this individual outside of Russia who saves Russia from the coup. And for the very first time in the recent decades, Kremlin owes something to someone. And what did Lukashenko get from all this? First and foremost, he got money because he got a huge discount on the gas prices. And the second thing is they started their parliamentary elections campaign in Belarus because in the beginning of 2024 they will have elections. And there's currently political transformation in place, they're creating new parties. And so it is important for Russia to have a Russian bloc in Belarus. It might be marginal, but it will be pro-Russian, because Lukashenko himself, he's scared of the direct contacts of Russians with his governors. But when there will be a party in place, it will have direct contacts, and that will be the first step towards directly influencing political processes in Belarus. And official Minsk government will probably demand for Russia at this stage for the next 6 to 7 months to not intervene in these processes. Lukashenko got some benefits, of course. And we should also not forget about the interests of Lukashenko handyman in Africa. The issue was that while those businesses were small, it was all right. They could cooperate with local governments. But when these businesses started to become transnational within the scale of Africa, it turned out that there were other players. And the most interesting example was the attempt to detain Zygmunt, who is the weapon man of Lukashenko in Congo. He was not supposed to be detained at all. And so, for the small transnational business, they need to have some force protection from an entity with a strong presence in Africa. And so it's not only Putin who owes to Lukashenko, but Prigozhin as well. And so now Lukashenko can ask for favors from Prigozhin. And let's remember that Prigozhin is not only associated with PMC Wagner, it's also the Patriot Media Group. The original trolls, the Rio Fran, and many of the channels in the new media, Lukashenko has an issue. Belarusian society has broken into a couple of factions. and they exist within their own information bubbles, and it's very difficult for Lukashenko to get a stabilized political platform that would exceed over his electorate of 35%. Belarusian state propaganda is obsolete now. It's very old, it's ancient, and they cannot enter the new media era. But this is something that Prigozhin specializes in, and so that means that Lukashenko can ask for that favor, can ask for training, or can ask for media support, but this is long-term benefits. There is a key medium-term threat. Prigozhin will not keep silent. He will continue to critique Putin and Shoigu. Guarantees are one thing, but there will come a time when, let's say, from the territory of Belarus, because he might be in Africa or wherever, but let's say, from the territory of Belarus, someone is critiquing Putin, and so that person has to be dealt with, right? And then simultaneously, they will have to deal with someone who is protecting this individual, this whistleblower. Thank you all. I think that if you're interested, we'll be able to talk to our speaker later. I would like to also make a small announcement. On July 5th, we'll have a presentation. We have created the scenarios for the development of Ukrainian economy until 2023 with numbers, with stats. We have made an assessment of where we'll end up on 1st of January 2024. We'll have yet another presentation with Igor here. We have prepared a report on what is happening in Belarus also, and what we can expect from Belarus in the nearest future. And then on July 19th, Sergei Goromenko will be presenting our report on why are Russians creating this new ideology. So a lot of people are laughing at that right now, but this is a very important thing that we have to keep in mind, because Russians are quite seriously approaching this issue of developing a new ideology. They're funneling a lot of money. Why are they doing that, and how is it a threat to us? We will talk about that on the 19th. So I would like to invite all of you to this discussion. Thank you. Thank you.